Craig Rucastle's still winning for his upside down bookcase, which took me a while to actually sort out. But anyway, all right, it's 6:01 and we're going to finish on time tonight, so I'd like to start. My name's Arnagretta Hunter. I'm a cardiologist and physician. I'm the Human Futures Fellow for the Australian National University, and I'm the current chair for the Commission for the Human Future. And I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's webinar. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people on whose land I am tonight. I recognise that this land is their land that was never ceded over many millennia, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Tonight we're joined by people around Australia, and we have our international representation as well, and a cohort from around the world. So we'll start by perhaps acknowledging Indigenous peoples more broadly and thanking them for their stewardship, their knowledge and generosity of sharing ideas and offering us that hope for a better human future. The Commission for the Human Future, for those of you who don't know us, is a small volunteer organisation that brings together those of us who are concerned about how we might achieve the best future for humanity and the barriers that stand in the way. The work of the Commission focuses particularly on catastrophic risks such as climate change, environmental degradation, harmful use of artificial intelligence, the risk of nuclear war, and biological challenges such as global pandemics. Addressing the challenges of catastrophic risks are, of course, one of the great needs of our time. These risks either individually affecting the prospects of our human future or often collectively are interdependent. Climate change, for example, affecting water and food security and the risks of global conflict. These are some of the great challenges that are in front of us. But catastrophic risks can also be overwhelming in conversation, and the Commission for the Human Future has a particular goal to encourage and facilitate conversations that are accessible and inspiring in terms of the solutions and the way in which we might see our best human future. And so I'm sure that tonight's conversation will take us in that direction. And I'll start just by outlining the biographies of our two fabulous guests. I'm particularly pleased to be joined by Andrew Leigh. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Andrew, from your car as you're waiting for your children. Andrew, for those of you who don't know him, is a politician. He's an author, a lawyer, and a former professor of economics. He's been a member of Parliament representing the ACT since 2010 and is the current member for the seat of Fenner. He's a member of the Labor Party. He's currently the Shadow Minister for Treasury and the Shadow Minister, Assistant Minister for Charities as well. Andrew has qualifications in arts law. He has a Master's of Public Health and a PhD in Public Policy from Harvard and has honorary affiliations with the Crawford School at ANU. In addition to his academic work and his political career, he's an extraordinarily accomplished author with books on politics, policy, economics, and a personal favourite of mine that I've tried to get into the medical curriculum at ANU called Randomistas, on the importance of randomised controlled trials. Of course, Andrew also runs marathons on occasion and rides his bicycle good distances. He's also just released a really great book, and that's the topic of tonight's conversation. The book's titled, What's the Worst That Could Happen? Existential Risks and Extremes Politics. And in this book, he's exploring existential risks from pandemics to climate change, nuclear war, and artificial intelligence. He's explaining to us the reasons why we should pay attention to catastrophic risk. And he's also looking at the dynamic between how we might solve or address some of these major challenges and the interesting ways in which we find ourselves organised, particularly our politics, the rise of populism, and the way in which that might challenge our human future. So we're going to start today's conversation by focusing on Andrew's new book and getting him to talk a lot about that. And then I'm going to ask Luke Kemp to give us some of his thoughts. And so I'll just briefly introduce Luke at the beginning of today's discussion. Luke's a research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risks at the University of Cambridge. His research is focusing on societal collapse, climate change, and the politics of human extinction risks. His work's been covered by media outlets like the New York Times, the BBC, the New Yorker, and Late Night Live here in Australia. He holds a doctorate in international relations and a Bachelor of Interdisciplinary Studies from the Australian National University, where he's also an honorary lecturer. Luke's currently writing a book on societal collapse and transformation, which is going to be published with Penguin, hopefully in 2023. Luke's a current member of the board of the Commission for the Human Future, and he's joining us today from Cambridge. Thank you so much for joining us, Luke.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So, Andrew, let's start by talking about your book. Why did you want to write about existential risks? And can you tell us a little bit about the risks that you've focused on?
Well, thanks, Arnagretta, and thanks so much for the chance to speak with you today. You acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, and let me follow and do the same. Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal Wari, Dara Wari, Dindi, Wangara Linjinyan, and acknowledge any Indigenous people who are part of tonight's conversation. It was really lockdown that did it to me. It gave me a chance to think about some of these long-term challenges. And the more I thought about them, the more I was struck by the fact that we weren't talking about them more in the public debate. So if you think about the potential human future, but the amount of time we might have on the earth before the sun burns out, potentially we're about 0.3% of that of our way through that human future. And yet, if you believe people like Toby Ord, there's a 1 in 6 chance that we end the whole human project in the next century. Now, the human cost of that seems massive. You know, you think about all of the people who've come in the past. Well, the generations to come in the future hugely outnumber them, both in terms of the fact that the world's gotten bigger and that there's many more centuries ahead of us than behind us. So anything that ends the human project ends permanently the prospect of millions of people living lives of unimagined pleasure and satisfaction. The risks that the book looks at include nuclear war, pandemics, bioterrorism, and unaligned artificial intelligence. That's one which is often relegated to the realms of science fiction. But the more I spent time reading the literature, Arnagretta, the more I became convinced that we really do have to worry about an artificial intelligence which is more advanced than humans, and wouldn't necessarily share our objectives. So could end up treating us not necessarily maliciously, as in Terminator, but simply leaving our interest off to one side, as we do to the ants.
Right, so lockdown did it to me. That's a really great impetus, I think, for a book. And I look at, you've obviously spent a lot of time with the literature, and I'm sure many of the people who are joining us tonight or looking at this at a later point in time will be familiar with the literature, particularly Toby Ord's book on the precipice. And I'm struck by the balancing act between qualitative and quantitative assessment of risk. It's a really interesting issue. You quoted Martin Weitzman on climate change in that section on climate change, and saying that most everything we know about climate change is bad. Most everything we don't know tells us that it's probably much worse. And I'm really interested in this balancing act between what we understand quantitatively from a scientific perspective and what we might be needing to use our imagination for. How do you think we balance those two things, qualitative, quantitative assessment of risk, and which ones are more effective in terms of communicating the importance of these issues to our population?
This is a great question for politics more broadly. My general advice to people who are advocating on policy issues is that politics is about a combination of statistics and storytelling. You won't get very far if the facts aren't with you, but you won't be very persuasive if you don't have clear stories to tell. And in the case of climate change, it's clear that the central estimates are for a very hot planet, with some very unpleasant outcomes. But then sitting off in the tails are some extreme outcomes which you could think of as being catastrophic. You're talking about non-zero possibilities of warming that exceeds 6 degrees. Now, why haven't we talked too much about this? Partly it's because the models have tended to focus around the 4 degree as upper bound. Partly also that it cuts off in 2100. And if you run the models forward after that, particularly if you've got feedback loops, you can start to get these double-digit warming events, which involve sea level rises that swamp many of our coastal cities. Now, these aren't likely, But you should think about them a bit like home insurance and house fires. A house fire is not likely, but many of us have home insurance to take into account the very small possibility that it eventuates. And from what I've read of the science, the chance of catastrophic global warming over the next century is probably of the order of your house burning down in the next decade.
So that's an interesting way for us to think about it. And so from a policy perspective, if you're, or when you're in a position of making decisions on this, how do we do that balancing act between what is likely and what is catastrophic or completely devastating? And how do we prepare our populations across that spectrum of outcome?
Well, we need to be speaking about catastrophic risk and preparing people for the notion that just because something isn't likely, it doesn't mean we should ignore it entirely. We, for example, need to be concerned about nuclear war, even although nuclear war isn't probable. We need to be concerned about bioterrorism, even although chances are terrorists won't manage to get their hands on the sort of device or bad bug that could spell doom for humanity. And it's relatively cheap to tackle these things. You know, you look at the institutions that are set up to manage catastrophic risks, and by and large, they're running on the smell of an oily rag. We could massively scale up the investment in dealing with something like bioterrorism for a very modest cost. In the case of nuclear warfare, reducing the size of the arsenals on both Russian and American arsenals is of course a saving rather than a cost, and taking missiles off hair trigger alert and moving to a no first use approach are just sensible measures that makes an accident less likely and humanity more likely to survive for millennia to come.
Now, 1 in 6 as a potential estimate of something happening in the next decade or a century is not a small number. Really, it's not an insignificant risk. I want to talk about.
And can I just on that one in 6? Sorry to interrupt. Run that forward for a millennium, and there's almost no chance you get to the year 3000. So one way to think about this is playing Russian roulette repeatedly once a century. What are the odds you get through one round of Russian roulette? Well, that's 5 out of 6. But keep on going, and it gets very unlikely that you'll make it through the millennium.
So that's the other thing that's come up, I have to say, in a lot of the conversations that the Commission for the Human Future has had, is how we shift from the short-termism view of our political cycle, which might maybe somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, it feels like sometimes, towards something that gives us the chance to look beyond 2100, to look at our scientific modelling that actually looks into the next millennia. How do we change that narrative? How can we move to long-termism, do you think? Or is that where we start to talk about the political obstacles, barriers and techniques to improve things?
Look, many of us think in long term when we're planning. I mean, we take out mortgages over 30 years. We encourage our kids to get more education, knowing that education will pay off over a period of half a century or so. So planning for the future isn't unknown. But sometimes in politics, we can end up focusing much too much on the present and neglecting the opportunities to make small tweaks that can make society a whole lot safer. For example, if you're looking in the area of bioterrorism, we need much more careful regulations around gene printing to ensure that people aren't simply able to print off genes for particularly virulent bugs. We ought to be better at scanning airports to detect these sorts of bugs. And simple precautions like that can make a substantial difference. We can do that. It's almost zero cost compared to what governments are spending on other areas. In the case of climate change, really the catastrophic case simply increases the weight that we ought to put on the value of climate action. But as we've seen from modelling such as the Business Council of Australia's or the Reputex modelling that my side of politics got done, moving to renewables actually gives you economic benefits in terms of jobs and cheaper power. So there again, it's not a trade-off.
But perhaps this is the point where we could talk about the issues with populism. So you focused on populism as a potential serious threat to our capacity to contend with catastrophic risk. Can you explain your concerns about the states of our organised democracies around the world at the moment?
Yeah, populism is the idea that politics is a contest between a vile elite and the pure mass of people. Left-wing populists envisage the vile elite as being the rich. Right-wing populists envisage the vile elite as being migrants or intellectuals. And right-wing populism has been on the rise over recent years. We've seen Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. We've seen the rise of the far-right movements in Britain. We've obviously seen Donald Trump's presidency. There's a spate of countries in which populists have come to power in recent years as a result of factors such as the loss of middle-class jobs and the weaponising of anti-immigrant sentiment. Populists are a danger for thinking about catastrophic risk because their very business model relies on ratcheting up the temperature, trashing institutions and attacking international engagement. And a calm head, strong institutions, listening to experts and engaging with other countries is precisely what we need in order to reduce global catastrophic risks.
And so just before I bring Luke Kemp in, you do have some ideas about how to fix politics. What are your main ideas about how we might do this better?
Well, Jefferson had this idea that the Constitution should be updated about once every generation, which in his day was 20 years, in our day about 30 years. And yet the world's biggest democracy, or sorry, one of the world's biggest democracies, the United States, I shouldn't be insulting our Indian viewers, the United States hasn't updated its democracy regularly enough. So I suggest a number of measures such as preferential voting, compulsory voting, better citizen engagement that would help to modernise the US political system and ensure that it is more representative of the population at large. We also need to be better on my side of politics, the progressive side, and making sure that we're never talking down to people, and that, for example, the education systems that we're providing are accessible to all. I think there's a real risk if education becomes the province of those who grew up in affluent backgrounds, that people begin to see progressives as being snobbish and not caring about their concerns, and that is one factor that's been tapped by populists.
So, Luke, I'd actually like to bring you in at this point in time. Can you give us your thoughts from the work that you've done looking at that interrelationship between catastrophic risks and political structures? Your thoughts on populism, particularly in existential risk?
Yeah, populism, it's a difficult one, and it's a term I've never been particularly fond of since I feel it's often very polysemic. It has multiple kind of interrelated meanings which we often confuse with one another. So interestingly, I spend a fair bit of my time reading both archaeology and history, and those two fields have almost a semi-populist view insofar as you, in any case study, you almost always talk about elites and kind of commoners, peasants, plebs, masses, etc. And I think there's almost a kind of good populism where you can say, yes, there are elites, and yes, political structures do not adequately or appropriately represent people. However, there's a difference between that and saying the elites are vile and need to be, deconstructed or destroyed in some way. When we look at some populists, such as Bernie Sanders, for instance, it's kind of hard to see that being a threat to or a cause of existential risk. I mean, he's someone who puts forward much stronger climate change mitigation measures. He, I think, wants to actually decrease some of the military US budget. And in general, I think most of the problems we have when it comes to politics and existential risk are much deeper than the current issues of populism. If we look at, for instance, nuclear war and the kind of arms race of the Cold War, that occurred underneath many kind of very centrist political candidates. Likewise, we look at the rise of surveillance states and technology, something that Andrew, I think, very presciently talks about in the book. Those are things that are, once again, quite bipartisan. If we look at, for instance, the NSA, the issue is they largely operate outside the purview of the political apparatus and kind of have bipartisan support. And it's less that they are being driven by one particular populist candidate. Likewise, with climate change, the issue has not necessarily been that populists have been destroying the planet and ramping up fossil fuels. That's, again, in many countries been a pretty bipartisan act. If you look at the US, emissions have increased under even Democratic presidents, and even the kind of most progressive candidates like Barack Obama substantially opened up the gas industry, and I think did a pretty bad job in terms of trying to preference the Paris Agreement towards US interests. Similarly, Bill Clinton's Code of Protocol. So I think it's difficult to tag everything on populism. I think that is definitely a unique challenge of our age, but I also think it's important to think, why are people drawn to populism right now? And Andrew has some really interesting thoughts here in terms of jobs. Was it jobs, snobs, wages, pace, and something else? Even though it was a very kind of catchy set of terms. And I wonder...
Andrew,
jobs, snobs, race, pace, and luck.
Yeah, it's the 5 things that drive populism.
Very catchy.
Yep.
Yeah, I do wonder, and this would be an interesting question for Andrew, is can we address populism and have it decrease in the long term, once again thinking of this course of decades and centuries, without addressing these kind of really big underlying factors? So both the very structure of our democratic systems, but also things like wealth inequality.
So, Andrew, back to you. If we are addressing populism, and you give us some good ideas about how we might actually reform political structures, democratic structures, to address the rise of populism, will it help us in the long run? How do you see that beginning to play out?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is certainly clear to me, at least, that the United States is in a far better position for combating the COVID pandemic, given that Donald Trump is no longer president. There are lives that have been saved by that transition, and not to mention the infrastructure package, which I think it's easy to be distracted from the historical lessons here, but this is the biggest infrastructure package since the New Deal, and it's fairly clear that it wouldn't have happened under a different administration. So there's significant benefits outside catastrophic risk, but in terms of catastrophic risk, I think there's an awful lot that can be done. Careful diplomatic engagement with North Korea and Iran is really vital in terms of making sure that the North Korean nuclear program doesn't get worse, and also that Iran doesn't first acquire nuclear weapons and then, as I expect would shortly afterwards happen, become a proliferator. And that is the careful and painstakingly work of good centrist diplomats, but it's absolutely vital to making the world a safer place.
Look, the other issue that you raise in the book, and Luke has been writing on the stomp reflex, which is a fantastic term for the way in which we use our emergency powers to combat periods where the threats might be significant, or perhaps sometimes where the threats aren't as great. And so that balancing act between mitigating our existential risks that we might face, or the catastrophic risks, or even just the sort of risks that we're facing with a coronavirus pandemic, that how do we ensure that the strategies that we put in place to mitigate these risks are strengthening our democratic engagement, strengthening our communities, rather than undermining it?
I think it is important that we continue that democratic conversation. There needs to be a space where people can have a conversation about whether the safety of vaccines and about the appropriateness of lockdown measures. They're utterly reasonable conversations to be having. But it would be good if we saw all parliamentarians calling out the way in which, say, neo-Nazis have infiltrated many of the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination movements. If those groups are looking to weaponize race for political gain. And that's one of the things you often see with political entrepreneurs. I talk in the book about Ed Glazer's work around the politics of hatred, where Glazer says there is an optimal size of an ethnic group to be demonized. If it's too big, you can't afford to get that ethnic group offside because you'll never manage to win a majority. If it's too small, then there's no point demonizing them because they're not a credible threat. But when a minority ethnic group gets to a certain size, then suddenly political entrepreneurs fall over their feet in order to try and use that ethnic group for political gain. And it's a dangerous game, and combating that use of political racism is hard work, but absolutely crucial work to first of all stamping out racism, but secondly stopping one of the key ways in which populists get into power and then imperil the planet.
Luke, do you want to perhaps explain to people watching about the stomp reflex and about the way in which that plays into existential risk?
Yeah, of course. So the stomp reflex is a term I use for the exercise of both emergency powers, which are essentially powers that we activate during a crisis that deviate away from existing laws and potentially even temporarily suspend laws, as well as, in some cases, the Constitution. These are often operated under the purview of things like a state of emergency, for instance. And while they can be, of course, useful in terms of having dramatic and swift actions, which are sometimes necessary, they also can lead to some kind of what I call despotic drift. So if you look at, say, for instance, the descent from the Weimar Republic into Nazi Germany, or the transition from the Roman Republic into Roman Empire, both those were marked by rapid and very large-scale use of emergency powers, which eventually led to the kind of installation of dictatorship. And I think when we think about existential risk, there's also some kind of interesting parallels here. So if you look at, for instance, nuclear war and the US, so there's been some really interesting arguments from Elaine Scarry, who is a political scientist in the US, that when the US developed a sufficiently large nuclear arsenal, and under the suggestions of different international relations experts, they put that under the approval of a single individual, the president, who can launch a nuclear strike by themselves. They require some consultation, but ultimately the decision rests with them alone. She terms that a thermonuclear monarchy. So she believes that the US has essentially transitioned from democracy into monarchy because there's a single individual, a single monarch, a regent who has complete and utter violent power. And similarly, if you look at the US in terms of secrecy, Alex Wallenstein's had a fantastic book on how the entire kind of way that the US and the US military in particular deals with secrecy just massively ramped up after nuclear war. And it's really unclear if that was actually helpful in any case. But in any case, I think the use of emergency powers, the really interesting and marked thing is they always go top down. It's always about empowering a hierarchy, essentially. And that doesn't really fit with what we find in disaster risk management studies, which tend to find that people are actually really good at responding pro-socially and collaboratively when it comes to crises. And that when you actually look at the exercise and use of emergency powers, they don't correspond to better outcomes. There was actually one really interesting article which looked at a wide set of different natural disasters and catastrophes. And in each case, even once you controlled for the size of the disaster, the number of emergency powers used actually results in a high body count. And I think for me, when I think about the longer term, I'm probably just as worried about enhanced authoritarianism as I am about extinction. And one of the interesting, difficult questions is how do we grapple with and reduce existential risk without resorting to a stomp reflex, which seems to be, thus far, when we look at nuclear weapons, for instance, the kind of template that we follow. So I'd be interested in Andrew's ideas in terms of thinking beyond COVID and thinking that this broader set of risks, like biological weapons, for instance, climate change, etc. How do we do this in such a way that we actually re-empower democracies rather than resort to securitization and towards empowering hierarchies?
Andrew, I think that's for you. Yep.
Excellent. All right, I was waiting for your cue there, Arnagretta.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been experimenting with as a parliamentarian is deliberative democracy. I've been impressed by reading a whole lot of the work that's been done in this space, and so held a number of deliberative democracy forums around conscience vote that we just had in the Parliament, and doing things like telephone town halls in order to engage people who'd otherwise be disengaged from politics. So that experimentation, I think, is important, particularly in an era in which trust in government is on the wane, and in which we know that people who are less engaged with politics tend to be more disadvantaged. So if you look at who writes to their local MP, who marches in a protest, who's ever met their MP, overwhelmingly those things skew affluent, despite the fact that more disadvantaged Australians are more likely to need government in their own lives. They're less likely to access government. So I've been working on that on my own and with colleagues in order to try and close up that democratic deficit. But I think there's a whole lot of other interesting ideas around. One of the books that I found really influential in the last couple of years was Tufts political scientist Ethan Hirsch's book, Politics is for Power, in which he argues that too much of what passes for political engagement is more like barracking for a sports team rather than actually being part of the political process. So if you're posting a snarky tweet about the leader of the opposition or the Prime Minister, then that's all well and good, but don't think you're actually engaging with politics in the way that you would if you went down to your local council meeting and offered up your views on a new development and how it would affect the local amenity and the climate.
Mm. I think that's part of what the Voices for movements are trying to do in Australia, I think, is to try and reinvigorate the conversation, the process, not the candidate or something like that.
Yes, but
yes.
Let me just push you a little bit on that. So one of the things Etan identifies is the move towards the national. Barack Obama made this point with police brutality, where he said people were asking the White House to do something about an issue that was overwhelmingly run at the local level. It's not considered very sexy to go along to a local council meeting, but if you're one of 20 people in a room, you really can make a difference. And so I hope Voices for isn't just mobilising, trying to get people into federal parliament, but it's also trying to get people really active in their local communities.
Yeah, so that's certainly been I think that is the most important part of our time, is trying to move power from a national or a global focus to bring some of the decision making and engagement down to a local level. I suspect, at least that's part of my theory of how we contend with existential risk, is actually at a local level with our communities. It's how we'll certainly be contending with the adaptation that's required for climate change.
Yes.
There's a really good question in the chat. We've seen societies collapse before, even due to some of the factors that we're facing at the moment, like climate instability and resource extraction. Do we have examples from history of existential risks not leading to inequity and political extremism? Luke, I'm going to give you the first go at that question. You've been looking at how societies collapse. What sorts of things have you found?
And it's a long list. So if you look at the Western Roman Empire by itself, there's a very famous list put together by, I think his name was de Brandt, a German historian, and he came up with over 198 different reasons as to why the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And some of these are quite well known. So things like environmental degradation, obviously incursions from the north by the Gauls and the Vandals and the Visigoths. And some were much more odd, such as culinary excess and homosexuality. And I think we can just kind of put them in the dustbin of history as really bad ideas that shouldn't have been considered. For me, the one that seems to be much more compelling across a large number of case studies, which is what I'm trying to do in the book, is rather than just trying to cherry pick very particular empires or case studies, and look across the grand sweep of all states, is states tend to grow more fragile over time as they become more unequal. And that leads to a whole number of different feedback effects, such as increased corruption, intra-elite competition, etc. And as they become more fragile, eventually a shock, whether it's a disease, climate change, or something else, usually pushes them over the edge. That being said, I think it's good to be skeptical of this notion of collapse. So the chapter I'm actually writing in the book right now is called The Bright Side of Dark Ages. And interestingly, when you look at many kind of post-collapse periods, they're marked by a whole bunch of things which we'd probably consider good. So one thing is that collapse tends to act as a great leveler. It essentially kind of levels out wealth inequalities. And interestingly, it's often in post-collapse periods that things become much more democratic once again. You know, when we look across history and think about collapses, we're usually pointing towards very predatory imperial states. You know, the Western Empire is essentially a military machine for turning grain into swords. And it's easy to look at the monuments and feel a sense of longing and nostalgia, but we have to also think about what these political entities actually meant for their people. And when I actually look throughout history, and one of the kind of more counterintuitive things put forward in the book is we shouldn't really be worried about collapse per se, but rather be worried about the rise of empires and imperial apparatuses. If you look at the worst kind of mass mortality events throughout history, it's basically the Golden Horde, so the expansion of Genghis Khan throughout Eurasia, the colonization of South America, which led to the death of potentially around 80 to 90% of the indigenous population at the time, and potentially the Black Death. And across each of those, of course, there were collapses involved. You know, in the case of the invasion of South America, it was both the Inca, the Zapotec, and the Aztec, but it was really much more about, in a way, the rise of power. And I think similarly, when we think about existential risk as well, I think sometimes we get distracted thinking about systems collapses, which are, of course, something we should be worried about, and much less that right now we're building up a huge amount of risk in the system through the exercise of power, essentially. And the thing that worries me about collapse going to the future is not necessarily the collapse per se, but rather that we now have nuclear weapons available, and the kind of the transition risks of moving from a high wealth state to a more decentralized one, which is essentially what a collapse is, are much higher.
Yep. So Andrew, I know that we are going to finish on time, and I'd like to bring this back to the Australian context. I think you're publishing your book at a really important moment in time, and I'm particularly interested, both personally and professionally, particularly through the Commission for the Human Future, on how we can put catastrophic and existential risk into the policy space for government, for our communities, into our next election cycle. How can we put these discussions into our politic? And I think we actually have an attendee with us who's been part of the select committee in the UK that's created a document on preparing extreme risks and building a resilient society. We probably haven't done as much of this in the Australian context. So how do you think we can transform our Australian politic towards better preparation and mitigation for these existential risks that you've taken us through?
Well, Arnagretta, I think there's great potential for doing it through the lens of insurance. Insurance is a very familiar concept to many of us, and we're dealing with some of the repercussions of insurance, indeed through extreme climate change events, and the conversation around the Northern Australia reinsurance pool as part of that. But it's because it's a familiar concept, it's a straightforward way of dealing with catastrophic risk. Look, these things probably aren't going to happen, but why not spend a little bit of money, think of it as an insurance premium, and massively reduce the cost? You know, wouldn't it make sense to lock your front door today, even although chances are if you left your front door wide open, you'd come home at the end of the day and your TV would still be there. So encouraging people to think about big payoffs for small investments is in my view, a natural way of framing the debate, but it'll be different for each of those catastrophic risks. Australia in the past has played a really important role for the Canberra Commission for the elimination of nuclear weapons. We have at times played a leadership role on climate change, though now is not one of those times. And I think we've also got potential to do that in the case of pandemics and bioterrorism. We have a comparative advantage in our foreign aid program in working with fragile states. You've seen our work with fragile states, and catastrophic risk is a natural counterpoint to the risks that fragile states face. You know, for a country like Tuvalu, whose average land mass is 6 metres above water, climate change is already existential. So the work we're doing in the Pacific is a natural way of engaging with these sorts of issues. But it was fascinating for me to listen to Luke's reflections there on society's ending, because when we remind ourselves that civilizations have ended, it does, as they say, focus the mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. Luke, have you got any suggestions for us in the Australian political context on how we might be better prepared to tackle existential and catastrophic risks moving forward?
Good question.
Yep.
When I think about existential risk, I tend to think of it less as a set of discrete hazards like nuclear weapons, biological weapons, climate change, etc. I tend to think of it much more as what's the emergent level of overall risk from a given system. So when you look at the IPCC and the way it both defines and operationalizes the concept of risk, a risk is composed of a hazard, a vulnerability, exposure, but also the response as well. And the combination of those four, they have institutional drivers, which is something I've been talking about in this article I recently published called Agents of Doom, that essentially when you look across most existential hazards, they all have fairly similar institutional drivers, and they tend to be sets of very powerful networks and actors, so the military-industrial complex, big tech, the fossil fuel industry and lobby, etc. And so for me, addressing those unfortunately requires, I think, much more deep and less superficial modifications. And it usually means, I think, something which Andrew touched upon, so a little bit of democracy, and not just simply in terms of having more experiments, but potentially actually changing the way we do democracy in the first place. I'm a big fan of Helene Mandelmann's work on democracy, and she characterized existing representative democracies being more about consent to power rather than the exercise of power. And so I think in that sense, I'd probably like to see things move much more towards politician, away from electoral politics. But in any case, you need some kind of leveling, I think, power for politics. I think similarly, we need to address wealth inequality. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing that. And we also need to find some way in which to grapple with and combat secrecy hazards in the military. Because I think if we're to see any new existential risks arise in the future, it's almost certainly going to be in probably a powerful military establishment and probably under secrecy. So that's just a short suite, but in short, I think it requires pretty deep structural changes to the way power is exercised in the world.
Absolutely. That is they're extremely sobering parts and great thoughts for us to be taking, I think, into our Christmas holidays. Andrew, have you got any final words on your book? Thank you so much for sharing these visions with us. What would you like us to take away from the book? What would you like us to discuss over Christmas lunch this year?
I think too much of this is framed through bads rather than goods. So we think about the disaster movies, whether that's 28 Days or Terminator or The Matrix, and we worry a lot about what could go wrong. And that's no conversation to be having over the Christmas table. What I'd like us to think about is the potential, if we get it right, for our successors to be living lives of just unimaginable pleasure and beauty and fulfillment, creating a world full of meaning, being able to live for much longer than we are. And for those of us who have kids, we should think of these as being our offspring. So dealing with global catastrophic risk is the best legacy we can leave our kids. And if we get it right, then they and potentially thousands of generations of humans will live these really amazing lives. And when they look back, they'll look back at those folks at the start of the 21st century who faced down global catastrophic risk and said, we've got to do something about this, and massively reduce the hazards that could have seen humanity collapse at that key moment.
Andrew Leigh, Luke Kemp, it has been such a pleasure speaking with the two of you today about your book, Andrew. And I, again, would like to commend the book to the audience. What's the worst thing that could happen? Existential risk and extreme politics. I'm going to take your idea, and that's the book. It's finally in Australia physically, and it will be released at some point, commonly available in our bookshops, hopefully in the near future. I'm going to take that particular positive spin to my Christmas lunch and to many of the weeks afterwards, as I know we're all looking forward to catching up with friends and family and beginning to look toward the future again. I think that's been one of the impacts of the pandemic in the last 2 years, is that our future horizon has been interrupted in a way that's actually difficult to contend with. So thank you so much for your words of inspiration. Thank you very much to our audience tonight. And we wish you all the best with the book, Andrew. Thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thanks, Arnagretta. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks both.
Bye.